Chapter 8, Too Long at the Fair.
The feel and the scope of it came in part from my having attended the New York World's Fair in 1965. My parents took me there. I was in high school at the time, and the setup was much the same. Actually, some of the exhibits came from companies who'd been at the Century of Progress, like General Motors and General Electric. The 646-acre fairgrounds had exhibitions, performances, films, art, and food from 80 nations, 24 states, and 350 American companies. The 1964 to 1965 New York World's Fair was held in Queens on the same grounds as the 1939 New York World's Fair, which had in part been mounted to try to outdo Chicago's hugely popular 1933-1934 fair. I had been to county fairs and to the Iowa State Fair, which itself was pretty impressive, still is, but the New York World's Fair was something else entirely. It gave me a sense of what the Chicago Century of Progress exhibition must have been like in 1933, which had only been a little over 30 years before. Those memories were helpful to say the least, but what I really depended on were two scrapbooks. One, turned up by researcher George Hagenauer, was massive, thicker than the Chicago phone book at the time, and large enough to paste in full magazine pages. It had been assembled by someone affiliated with the fair who recorded press coverage and advertising materials. It was expensive to acquire, and I couldn't afford to keep it. It wound up in the hands of a collector. My longtime collaborator on the Ms. Tree comic book, Terry Beatty, provided a second scrapbook, one kept by his grandmother when she attended the fair as a child. They did, but casino did not in that instance mean gambling. They did sell beer, legal by then, so Heller and Marianne Beam relaxing there is something they might well have done. Heller and Marianne chatting over Pabst Blue Ribbon beer allow me to share with the reader Heller filling in his client on what he's been up to, about the investigation into her brother's whereabouts, some of which appears on stage in the novel. Readers of the book will, I think, be surprised, and I hope, pleased by how much of the novel is included in the TRUE NOIR dramatization. But some compression and some reorganization was necessary. What I hoped to recreate about the fair was the crazy aspect of it. That while all of these high-flown exhibits about science and industry did draw crowds, fairgoers were there much more for the carnival aspect of the Century of Progress. The rides, the streets of Paris with Sally Rand doing her fan dance, the plastic dinosaurs, which were also at the New York World's Fair 30 years later, and the giant boy on the equally gigantic radio flyer Red Wagon. There was a good share of giantism at the fair, which may have fueled the imaginations of Batman artists like Dick Sprang, who frequently sent the Cape Crusader and Robin into landscapes filled with oversized props like giant cash registers and guns and cameras. The other overriding element at the fair was the future, which in the Depression represented an almost desperate vision. Several modernistic houses were on hand. My wife Barb and I live in a home built in 1935 by the local movie house impresario, based on the Westinghouse House of the Future at the Chicago World's Fair. It's drawn from newspaper accounts and from Barney Ross's autobiography, No Man Stands Alone. That book, however, is a good example of the need to be careful about using celebrity autobiographies as a source. Barney actually gets the year wrong of the match. He does report, as do some of the papers of the day, his mother walking to the stadium some 5 miles because it was Shabbos, just to be with her son after the big fight. Apparently, she didn't listen to his fights on the radio, much less attend them. She claimed to hate boxing. It seems that Barney did walk her home, despite having been through the exhausting ordeal of a championship fight. Barney turns up in later Heller novels, covering the boxer's battle with drug addiction. which was a result of his wartime combat injuries. Marianne working as a radio actress in Chicago of the day is very feasible. And there was a Hollywood pavilion at the fair with shows broadcast in the manner described in True Noir, a glassed-in, padded-wall radio studio in front of a theater audience. Stars from Monogram Pictures were on hand as guests at the Hollywood pavilion, although that's an overstated way of putting it, since Monogram was strictly Poverty Row, as the lesser Hollywood studios were called then. So it's credible that Marianne could have been seen by a scout and signed up for a two-reeler that would essentially be a screen test for her. Movie stars like Randolph Scott, Ginger Rogers, Alan Ladd, and Ava Gardner started out at Monogram, but they didn't stay long. Quite a while ago, I wrote a chapter in one of those multiple author books where a bunch of writers are asked to write one chapter each of a collective novel. I used Nate Heller and wrote what is probably my favorite line from any Heller story. "The night was as starless as a movie from Monogram." I have always wished I'd saved that for one of the novels. The Sky Ride was a big attraction, carrying visitors across the lagoon at the center of the fair. Its span was over 1,800 feet, and the two towers stood over 600 feet. Easily the most prominent structure at the fair. Suspended from the span, 215 feet high, were rocket-shaped Art Deco cars, each carrying 36 passengers. The two towers were named Amos and Andy. Amos on the west, Andy on the east. Workers building the towers had nicknamed them that way, and the fair officially picked that up. The Amos and Andy radio show broadcasting out of Chicago was a very big deal. The individual gondola cars were named after various characters from the show. Amos and Andy was not a comedy show originally, but a soap opera with comic elements. In later years and on television, it was a situation comedy focusing on the Kingfish character. I wrestled with whether or not to do a sequence where Heller is pushed off one of the towers. It was not the kind of sequence you typically saw or even see now in a private eye novel. It seemed too big, potentially too melodramatic. A few of Mickey Spillane's My Camera novels had big scenes as climaxes. My Camera trapped in a burning building or shooting it out in a warehouse filled with foreign agents. I finally took a crack at it and liked what I came up with. My novel True Detective, the source of True Noir, was, because of its length and like the Chicago World's Fair, its scope, felt like it could support a sequence so outlandish. One of my mentors, Don Westlake, didn't like it, but Mickey Spillane did.